All right, well, welcome back, everybody. So no other questions or comments from last week? Everybody's good? All right, so we'll just, last week we covered the textual criticism. For you guys who weren't here, we basically took how secular historians determine that written history is true, like for Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and whatnot, and we applied that to the Bible, and we were showing basically how that basically blows away any other secular history. So if you're going to say that the Bible's not historically accurate based on the evidence, you can pretty much wipe away any form of history at all. So we talked about some perceived contradictions and showed they weren't really contradictions. I was waiting for Paul to bring in some bomb pops today, but he didn't take the hint. Yeah, he's probably roasting himself. So, and then where we left off, basically we left off was a document written close to the time of the event, and yeah, it was closer than any other document in history, because we basically for books of antiquity or writing antiquity, Homer was the closest at 400 years from the time of his original writings to his first copies are available. In the New Testament, we have up to 60 years, and I think I can't remember. I think. Dr. Wallace was saying for complete New Testaments, I forget how many he said we have. I think he said about 100 within the first 100 years, full New Testament documents, just in Greek alone. So yeah, it was closer to any other. And then, of course, once you start counting the other languages, we have well over 20,000 copies available, where the average works of antiquity has maybe 7 to 15 on average. So the New Testament blows everything away. So our next question, moving in, is what we have in the Bible today, what the authors originally wrote, and has been corrupted over years? Because that's one thing that Bart Ehrman likes to tout. A lot of atheists like to say that it's been corrupted. Islam says it's been corrupted, even though when you look what the Quran says it hasn't been corrupted, and that the people of the book, which is us, should go by our Gospels in the Bible, but a lot of people say that. So I want to show you Dr. James White. He's from Alpha and Omega Ministries out of Arizona, and I'll show you a quick look at him before I go into that. Go ahead.
I know this is review.
Yes.
So there are contemporary copies of the books of the Bible. Contemporary being within the reasonable, you said 60 years.
The first P51 is the oldest parchment they found, which is a small little part, has parts of John on both sides, and that was estimated.
We still have them.
Yes, yeah, and that's what we're talking about. Is what we still actually have, okay, not what's been destroyed.
So we have these early documents.
Yes.
And we still have them, so we can compare them to find out where they've been from.
Yeah, exactly. So out of all the copies they talk about, and there's actually more and more every year, because there's still a bunch of manuscripts that are from the New and Old Testament that just haven't been verified yet. There's so much of it that they go through. They won't count them until they've actually verified that they're actually legitimate manuscripts. They're not forgeries, or they're not from other time periods. So they go through them. So that's why when the first set of slides I had, when we were talking about when Dr. Wallace was talking, that may be 6 years old, I think, that particular video, maybe less. And at that point, there was 5,500 copies in Greek, just Greek alone. And now it's up to over 5,800 copies in Greek alone, because as they're verifying them, they add them in. But they don't want to count them. They can just, of course, say, well, here, these all have biblical text on them, so here they are. We have them all. But then they don't want to have somebody come back to you later and be like, well, these are forgeries, these are forgeries. Like if you go, has anybody been to the Bible Museum in Washington, D.C.? The people who started that bought a whole bunch of, they bought manuscripts, artifacts, things like that, and they opened that museum. We'll come to find out a lot of stuff in the museum are actually forgeries. And that's why when they're doing the manuscripts, they don't want to release them until they've been verified, because even though you can show all 5,800 manuscripts that are legitimate, all it takes is for somebody to be like, oh, well, here, these three here are forgeries, and they're going to discount the other 5,800 because it's what everybody does. When I talk about when we're witnessing to people from other religions, making sure you're correct on everything, because you can sit there and witness to them for 2 hours and show them fact after fact after fact after fact, and then at the very end you can say one thing wrong, and they'll discount everything you said before that because of one little thing.
So, what organizations are doing the translations currently?
There's a whole bunch doing the translations, as far as, and then verifying. Yeah, verifying goes to many different organizations, because there's organizations that specialize in the paper to verify that the paper was actually manufactured at that time period. There's organizations that verify the writing styles, because most of the time that's how they're dating everything. And we'll see next week, I'm going to show a video called Fragments of Truth. It's going to go over a little bit more of some of the stuff we've been talking about. And they'll take how they date a lot of manuscripts by the writing style, because the dates on, say, when they find a manuscript on, like for Mark, there's no date written on it when that was actually copied. But there's other letters of antiquity that they have, correspondence between people or news events or whatever, those have dates on them. So what they'll do is they'll take those manuscripts without dates, and they compare the writing styles to the ones they have with dates. And they see, basically the verbiage they use, the techniques they use to make the letters and all that, and they can date them based on that. So there's organizations specialized in that against ones that specialize in the parchment or the papyri. So it goes through many different entities before they verify it.
I know the Vatican has had a major project going to digitize a lot of the old documents.
Yeah.
And I know they don't say it, but I think they have a lot more of the old stuff in captivity in their vaults or whatever than they say.
They're not saying that they have it. It may be because it's not verified, because there'd be really no reason to not say we have more evidence than they actually have. But yeah, they're digitizing it. And also Dr. Daniel Wallace, who we watched last week, he runs the Center for New Testament Research, and they're doing the same thing. They're going through digitizing as much as they possibly can in case things get destroyed or we're out that way. It was all documented and verified.
So they digitize it and verify it.
Yeah. And you can, no, it's verified first. Well, I guess it just depends. Because sometimes they'll digitize it and then they'll send those digital photos to the people that do specialize in the writing styles, because they don't need the actual parchment itself to verify. They could just use copies off of that. So it just probably depends on the availability. Like whoever is the one, say it's a museum there's a lot of museums that have a lot of parchments and papyri and documents, and they're still stored waiting to be verified. As a matter of fact, in the video Fragments of Truth we'll watch next week, one of the guys in there talks about somebody ran a museum. It's like, well, you got to come over here. We got boxes of them. They just haven't been verified yet. So it probably just depends on who's coming over to verify it, and then who does that first.
Boxes?
Yeah.
I'm thinking that they would have them in some kind of a sealed environment.
Oh yeah. They're it's a sealed box. And some of them are in boxes, but in the box, them being in the box, they're between like panes of glass that are totally sealed, so they don't get any more environmental work on them. But those things, but yeah, they are protected, but they are in boxes, but they haven't been verified. So whoever ends up being the first one, Dr. James White, who we're going to watch here next, he might have already gotten it. I haven't checked, but he's actually getting his third PhD, and this was in, I think, manuscript evidence. So he was actually studying P51 as well. I think he was studying. But they'll go over there, and they pull that stuff out, and everybody's got their gloves on, and you'll see some of it in the video next week, how they got them sealed between glass and everything, so they're all protected.
It's really neat if you go and look at the digitized Dead Sea Scrolls of Isaiah. You can look at that, and when you go in and you kind of put your finger on it or your mouse or whatever you want, it'll give you the translation
Oh, yeah.
at the same time, which is kind of neat.
Yeah. And you can go on the website for the Center of New Testament Manuscripts, and you can go through and look at all the digitized copies they have, and they'll tell you actually where it's the physical one is actually located, whether it's in Geneva or England. I have a friend of mine who's he's in Scotland right now, but he was in Dublin, so I sent him a text saying, "Hey, while you're there, Dublin's got a huge. It's in I forget the name of the library." This in, but they have a huge collection of some of the oldest manuscripts there. So I was like, well, you gotta check it out. He's like, oh, we already left Dublin. I'm like, oh, you just missed it. But yeah, it's really neat to see some of that stuff. But yeah, let's see what James White has to say about if we have what's written in the Bible today has been corrupted over time. And it kind of goes into some of the stuff I talked about a little bit last week as well.
The problem that New Testament scholars have is we've got so much to work with. That's the real issue. We have so many manuscripts to work with. The people in other areas that study something like, the manuscripts of Plato wish they had what we have, but they don't. They just don't have it. Now, remember the phone game? I think some people call it Chinese whispers. That's how, unfortunately, a lot of people today present the idea of the New Testament. And even when I was talking about how scholars present it, well, you have one copy and there's errors in it, and then it's copied and those errors are multiplied, then that assumes a single line of transmission over time. Is that how the New Testament came to us? The answer is that it is not. Instead, when you think about it, what you have in the New Testament is what I call multifocality. Multiple authors writing it multiple times to multiple audiences. All right? That means there's never, no one ever sat down and wrote the New Testament at one time and hence could control it. Paul's writing individual letters to churches. James is writing his letter. Peter's writing his letter. They're writing at different times, different places. Not even everybody knew that they were doing this at the same time. There's no cooperation. There weren't any cell phones, no fax numbers, anything like that at all. All right? So books get written, and then they get transferred to other places, and they get copied, and then they get moved to other places, and eventually what happens is you start putting collections together. For example, P66, the Gospels, P46, Paul. You start putting collections together, and then eventually, over time, you have the entirety of the New Testament. What you need to understand about this is that there were multiple lines of transmission. The transmission of the text of the New Testament did not follow a phone game single line. Not only are written documents less liable to corruption than what's spoken in whispered in your ear, because you've got something that's actual physical that you can look at, but the phone game involves a single line of transmission. The New Testament originated in multiple places, written by multiple authors, with books being sent to multiple locations, and this results in multiple lines of transmission, and that is extremely, extremely important. This multifocality leads us to the final considerations that demonstrate the bankruptcy of the modern attacks on the text of the New Testament. To make specific changes in a text like the New Testament, which originally circulated as a group of texts, not as a single body, would require a centralized controlling authority. You'd have to have, you've seen some of the movies where they have these rooms filled with monks, and they're copying stuff, and they're determining which books are going to be in the Bible. Never happened, never could have happened. It's all fiction. As often as people believe it, it doesn't matter. It's still all just a bunch of fiction. That's never how the canon was formed. That's never how the text of the New Testament was transmitted. Instead, you had this, Christians wanted everybody to have a copy of the Bible. They wanted everybody to know about the gospel. So they did not restrict the copying of their manuscripts. They couldn't, especially because the Romans said it was illegal to have them. And if they were destroying manuscripts, the church had to be producing manuscripts, or eventually the New Testament's going to be destroyed. And so you have this explosion of manuscripts all over the known world. That means there was never a time when anyone could have come along and said, well, any of you old enough to remember Shirley MacLaine? Remember Shirley MacLaine? And she got off into that New Age stuff for a while, and she did that movie Out on a Limb. And, she's walking along the seashore with her guru, and he's teaching her to say, I am God, I am God, I am God. We're all sitting there at home going, no, you're not, no, you're not, no, you're not. It's really weird. And she'd go around saying, well, the Bible used to teach reincarnation, but they took it out at the Council of Constantinople. And we all go, right. Except most of us have no earthly idea when the Council of Constantinople was, and we really couldn't give an answer beyond that anyways, could we? And so this, could that have happened? Could someone have taken a doctrine out or put a doctrine in? The answer is no. Not a possibility in any way, shape, or form, because there was never a time when there was a group that had control over the text of the New Testament. Now, there was a time in the history of the Quran when that happened. And this is a vitally important issue. I've debated this issue in London, going to be debating it in just a few weeks in South Africa. There was a time when a group, a committee, determined the text of the Quran. And what happens when you have a group that can control the text, you have to trust they got it absolutely right. There's no controls. But you see, we keep finding earlier and earlier and earlier manuscripts, and what they tell us, that what we've had all along is in fact what the New Testament has always said. So, there was no group like that. Could not have happened. Christianity was a persecuted religion made up mainly of the lower classes. There was no central authority could have ever gathered up all the text and made wholesale changes. Such was impossible in the earliest days of transmission, and given that we have such ancient texts now, obviously could not have happened at a later point without giving clear evidence. So in other words, if someone had tried to make a big change and took out chapters and put in chapters, as we find earlier manuscripts, those later manuscripts are going to stand out like a sore thumb. But that's not what we found. We found earlier and earlier manuscripts of the New Testament. So that did not happen in the history of the text. We can prove it. It's just simply an impossibility. It could not have happened. This is extremely important. Apologetically, this is extremely important for us to communicate to our young people and to all of us, because it's this conspiracy theory idea that is so prevalent amongst many people, not just because of Dan Brown, but because of others, that, we really can't know, maybe this deity of Christ thing was inserted later on. It is an impossibility because there was never an organization that could make that kind of change in the text of the New Testament itself. But that means all allegations of purposeful corruption, such as those made by Muslims, fall upon the mere considerations of the historical context and the data itself. The rapid, widespread distribution of New Testament manuscripts in the first 2 centuries precludes any purposeful centralized corruption, but it also gives rise to the need to study the relatively small number of textual variants, because they didn't make you take a manuscript copying class to make sure you were really good at it. If you wanted to have a copy, you could make a copy. Well, you might make some mistakes because you weren't the best copyist in the world. Well, that's why we have textual variants. So that's actually, when we really understand it, that's actually just simply the side effect of the way that God used to preserve the New Testament. Because it exploded all over the place, we can say with absolute confidence that there was no editing, changing, inserting, or anything else going on. And we could detect it if anyone tried it. But the result is we have to look at the textual variants. Because, look, if you want to say, I'm not going to believe God can give something until it can be done absolutely perfectly. You know the earliest point in time God could have given his revelation? 1949. You know why? 1949 is when they invented the photocopier. Even printed books have errors in them. Remember the edition of the King James Version where the printer forgot the word not in the commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery? There are errors that take place in printing too, because you got to put the little letters into the thing to make the printing. All it does is mean the errors you make get a lot more copies. So it was not until 1949, if you want to make absolute perfection of transmission the standard, that God could have given his revelation. I think God wanted to get around to it a little bit earlier than that. Now, real quickly, this leads to another important point. When scribes copied their texts, they were very conservative, often incorporating marginal notes into the text since they could not be sure if the note was original or not. When I have more time, what I love to do is I ask someone in the audience who has the NIV, could you read me John chapter 5, verse 4? And they start looking. There is no John 5:4 in the NIV. It goes from 5:3 to 5:5. Now, it's in a little teeny tiny font at the bottom of the page, but the verse has been taken out of the text because it is most probably a marginal note that someone had written an explanation. It's about the angel troubling the waters. And it was a marginal note, and a later scribe, not knowing whether it should be there or not, included it in the text. I mean, if you're copying someone else's handwritten text and they're dead, You can't go back to them and say, is this an explanation or is this supposed to be in here? And so scribes tend to be very conservative. They'd include it, which means later manuscripts get bigger and bigger and bigger by up to like 3% once you get into the later manuscripts, because they are including everything that's found there. So they're very, very conservative. Now, that's extremely important. That's actually a very, very good thing. That means they even preserved mistakes or silly readings. This may sound bad at first, but consider what it really means. The New Testament text is tenacious. Tenacious. That means once a reading appears in it, it stays in it, even if it's a bad reading. You go, why is that good? Think with me for a moment. That's how we know the originals are still there, because the text is tenacious. As long as it's been a reading, it's still there. And so when I'm looking at a variant and there's 3 or 4 options, one of them's the original. So when people say, you think we've got everything Paul wrote? Yep. Can you identify every bit of it? Well, in my critical text, I've got all of it. Now, there's some places where I have to go, well, it's possibly this or possibly that, but the original is still there. That's the important part. I heard an illustration once. I think it was Rob Bowman that used the illustration off the top of my head. And this is a very good illustration. It's like having a 10,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. Now, what's the worst thing that can happen to you when you put together a 10,000-piece jigsaw puzzle? The cat comes along one night and eats one of the pieces. And you get 9,999 put together, and then there's a hole in it. Isn't that the worst thing you could possibly have? Does anyone make jigsaw puzzles anymore? I mean, I think computers pretty well killed jigsaw puzzles. But anyways, what we have in the New Testament is we have a 10,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, and we have 10,100 pieces. Now, isn't it better to have 10,100 pieces than to have 9,900 pieces? You see, the extra 100 pieces are the scribal additions over time, and we have to work through them. But you see, the point is the 10,000 pieces that form the puzzle are all there. That's the vital issue. That's the important point to remember. No other work of antiquity could say that, because the time frames are too big, the number of manuscripts too small. The New Testament can. The New Testament can.
Stop. I couldn't stop that one without having to start it all over again, the way it was embedded in my video.
Okay, I have 2 questions.
Go ahead.
First one is, when they're looking at the old ones, how can we tell what generation it is? In other words, here's the original, here's the first generation, second generation, third generation. How do we know which generation we're looking at?
As far as the just like the year time period, or
So as we look back.
yeah.
I'm not
Well, they
that's where my second question comes.
Yeah.
So, no, I'm not sure I buy his statement about extra pieces being in there. I understand it and I accept it. I'm not sure that that's a benefit.
It is a benefit. Well, first we'll go for the first question about how the generations. They don't really label them as generations, such as like software. You have software 0.1, 0.2. Yeah, it's mainly they're dated by time periods, and it goes back to they can look at the parchment or the paper, how it's made, to match that up with the time period when they manufacture that way, the writing styles and things like that, and they'll get basically a date range of when that was done.
So is there a possibility that they can have 2 of them and they say this one's older than this one?
Yes,
Okay.
and that's exactly what they do, because they'll have a document and they can see, okay, the way this writing style was and the way either this papyrus or this parchment was made, they know that they only made the parchment that way or that papyrus that way between these 2 time periods. And then with the writing styles, comparing that to other known writing styles with dates on it, they can say, well, we know the way the letters are formed, the way this is, maybe where the grammar is. This is the way it was written between these times. So they're not able to lock it down to saying, okay, this was written on this date at this time, because there's no dates or times on them. But they'll get a date range, and then they'll have another parchment, and maybe that paper was made differently.
Say this one's an older version.
Oh, exactly, and that's what they do all the time. Yeah, they do that all the time.
That was the first question. My second one really comes back to just throwing out, hey, you got a bunch of extra pieces. It's okay.
Yeah, and
I'm not sure that I buy that.
Let me jump.
I understand it, and I accept what they've done in the Bible. I just don't think I buy his argument.
Yeah, let me go back, jump back real quick here. Let's take Luke 5:39. We talked about this last week. You'll see here we're just taking 4 manuscripts, okay, and just the one line in the 4 manuscripts. Let me get this so everybody can see. And no one after drinking the old wine desires new, for he says the old one is good. And then you have where it says the old one's better. If you look in your current study Bible, you'll see a note on there, and then on the bottom of the page, you can see some manuscripts say better. So that's an extra, basically an extra puzzle piece. But the way that's written in there is because possibly the scribe or the church father that was using this manuscript knew that the people he was talking to would understand better, easier, or that was just the grammar back then. Well, let's take more manuscripts and let's add more errors in. So now we have more, say, changes or mistakes that were in these other manuscripts. So these are technically more puzzle pieces that are in here. So if these mistakes were in here, you'd have the notes on the bottom of the page saying some manuscripts say X, some manuscripts say Y, letting you know that these are extras that they're not sure because they don't show up in all the manuscripts. The majority of the manuscripts show this, but some say this. Those are the extra puzzle pieces he's talking about. So with all these extra manuscripts, even though you have these extra puzzle pieces, do you think you can figure out what the original said? Because now we have to work through it. So now we look for the first error here showing is the and no X after drinking. You look at the majority of manuscripts, okay, that shows up in 1. So we pretty much figured that word was originally 1. The same thing with all the others. And let's say better shows up in more manuscripts. You can see that the vast majority say good. So working through those extra puzzle pieces, you can come to the conclusion that the original says, and no one after drinking the old wine desires new, for he says the old one is good. That's what he's talking about. The advantage of us having them showing us all these mistakes, or not necessarily mistakes, they could be changes, because it could be a change again, because when we showed my example showing the variance, and we showed the example, the manuscript saying my son Zach weighed 170 pounds when he was in the hospital, and one said weighed 77 kilograms. That change in that manuscript was obviously because that manuscript was going somewhere in Europe, and people in Europe understand kilograms over pounds. So that change was made. It's not an error, it's a change so the people in that region would understand it. These changes may not be mistakes. They may be changes so people in the region or who they're going to understand it better.
So if we go back to the word good and the word better.
Yes.
Is there a language where those 2 words aren't similar when you translate them?
Since I don't speak the other language, I have no idea.
As far as we know, there is.
As far as I know, yeah, they're probably pretty close. So, but there are some, like I showed. There's an error in some early manuscripts where it shows King Hezekiah, I believe it is, was 42 years old in one book and 22 years old in the other book. That difference was you only find that in a few manuscripts. You'll see it only in the King James Version of the Bible. I think the Wycliffe Bible. There's like 2 others. They're all basically copied in the 1600s. And when you look at the manuscripts they used, that was in there. But then when they go back and look and see, well, why was that? And they start looking at those manuscripts they used. Well, the one that said he was 22 years old, actually, they were able to trace those manuscripts back to a single region and pretty much came to the determination that, okay, the scribe copied that wrong. But that still follows. But that'll still show up because if you look in your study Bible, you go to that same verse where in the ESV, I think even in the New King James now and the NIV, they both say 42. They both say the correct number. It's either 42 or 22.
I was going to say,
but there's a note on the bottom.
Context, you can very often.
Yeah, but then looking at the bottom, it'll say, even though they've made it face, it'll still say on the bottom, some manuscripts say 22. The advantage of that, because biblical Christianity is the only religion that does that. The only one that says, hey, we're going to let you know all the changes, anything that might be off, so you have the entire picture. You're not just, it's not just, again, like I talked about last week, I have two different Books of Mormon. I have a 2015 copy and I have a 2020 copy. There's been a bunch of changes between the two. There's been a bunch of changes between my 2015 and then the 4 or 5 copies prior to that. But nowhere in that Book of Mormon does it say what, where, or why these changes were made. My New World Translation that the Jehovah's Witnesses use, tons of changes they made in there. Nowhere does it say these are the changes that are made. I have 2 different Qurans. There's been some changes. Nowhere in those Qurans have notes in it to say these are the changes made. Biblical Christianity, they want you to know the whole picture. Because like when Dr. White was talking about the Quran, there was a point in time, it was after Muhammad died, and I forget the name of the guy who took over. But they were starting to lose a lot of people. A lot of things were going over oral tradition, and they were losing a lot of people during the Crusades. So they got together, gathered everything they had, all the written documents, and the people who knew the written tradition the best, and they wrote it all out so they wouldn't, because they didn't want to lose what Muhammad had told them. So they wrote it all out, even though there's differences in a lot of the writing styles, and not the writing styles, but some of the things that were written. They basically worked their way through it and said, okay, this is what it says. And then they took all the written documents and burned them all. So you have no copy, you have no idea what some of these other changes were, what some of the other readings might have been. But biblical Christianity, they're like, hey, we'll let you know the whole thing.
With what they've done from this standpoint. I disagree with how he was presented.
Because if you take this out, if you take out these errors or variants, so you don't know they're there. For example, the NIV, what was it, John 5 something, I can't remember what he says, where it jumps, 5:4, thank you, where it jumps from 5:3 to 5:5. If they determined that the vast majority of manuscripts don't have that, so what they did is they took it out, added to the bottom to let you know some manuscripts say that. But if they didn't do this, and they just take it out, and you don't know, then you get, because probably every 4 or 5 years, I'll see that argument come through social media where they're like, oh, they changed the Bible. They took this out, and then they took out this and they're changing the Bible. So that way it's not true. But it's like, no, it's there in the bottom. It tells you.
You're preaching to the choir.
Yeah.
I'm just saying, the way he was presented in today's world, we have, and I'm sorry, young people, a lot of young people that pretty much take whatever somebody says and they believe it. And what he's saying is accurate, but it sounds weird.
I think that also it needs to be, it's great that, first of all, it's transparent that those things are taking place. It also shows you the power of the gospel, because it don't have to be this neat bundle like everybody else has it. They have it all. It's like there's like typed out on the computer. Ours is handwritten, meaning we don't worry about those little small things, because when we put all those texts together, we get the general idea of what the text was saying without having it fine tuned where somebody goes in there and try to make sure everything is said a thing. It's like if I send out a text message right now and I send a group text message to 20 people, my text message remains the same. If somebody forward it, they're going to forward the same thing. If they do not forward the same thing, you can actually go back to my original text and you can say, well, you took this out. Unless we have this we took this out because we found out that he didn't mean to send that one thing out. But we're going to show you where we did it. We're going to show you where we took it out, and the reason being, even though it might bring up some question, to me it lends more to the validity of the Bible. Because if we were trying to hide it, if we were trying to make everything so clean where you didn't have where we can, like, the stories would be easier if it was cohesive in such a way where one person did it or one group did it. But the way we have it is so open, it's so clear, and it's so hard to distort it. It even lends to the fact that it can be criticized by people outside. but it's so well done by God that even your criticism can't break it. Even if you look and see those little things in the margin, you still can't break it because it's clearly understood. And so I'm thinking that because it's the way it is, it lends more to being authentic than it is if it was fine-tuned, where you didn't have those things. So if you found those things out later on, if you gave me a text and you found it out, oh, wait a minute, why is that not there? Why is that not there? You got critical people like that. And then they're going to say, well, y'all hiding something. That's why I believe the Bible.
Yeah, yeah.
So, but since we already lay it out to you, and we give you the reason behind it, we give you clarity, and we allow you to cipher through it in any manner you want to, it lends to the authentic, that it being an authentic document. And I think it's good that it's there.
Yeah, and I see what you're saying about the way he explained it. You know, there's different ways you can explain it. That's just the way he happened to choose that period. So I can see it could be confusing at times with other people trying to explain it that way as well. And Bill, who's on watching on Zoom, he let me. He knew it was Trinity College in Dublin has the manuscript. So thanks for Bill for telling me. It's always nice. It's always good to have somebody that can jump on the keyboard. He probably knows it, but he might have jumped on the computer for me, found it. So Trinity College, if you're ever in Dublin, go to the library at Trinity College. You can see a bunch of these old manuscripts. And there's a bunch in Great Britain's got a bunch. Geneva and Switzerland's got a bunch. Some places that I wish that I was more versed in Christianity back when I was in the military doing a bunch of traveling. So I've been to a bunch of these places and had no clue this stuff was here. Now I want to go see it. So now my wife and I are going to go see them.
I have seen some of those. So, you can't dig down, you can't touch them. So.
Oh, you definitely can't touch them, yeah. But it'd be neat just to see them. Yeah, just look at them. That'd be kind of cool.
I was at a town in Spain called Toledo. We call it Toledo. It's Toledo.
Yeah.
And they had a library there that they had books. They weren't scripture, but they had books and documents that were there from 15 BC.
Oh, yeah.
Document.
That was, it's amazing. A lot of this, stuff. When I was in Moscow, I was in some building. I forget how old it was, but the staircase is in it. When you walked in, the staircase was as wide as this room. The banister at the end, the banister that you basically the handhold to go up it, I couldn't wrap my arms around it. It was so big. Everything was solid marble. And the stairs in the center were that thick of marble. But when it got to the edges, it got down to that thin, and they were bent down. There's two slopes in it from the hundreds of years of people walking up and down that staircase on the edges. It was interesting just to see. And that was now, I don't know what that building was when it was made, but it had these grand, like chandeliers. It was like super. And then, this is 1990, 91, right before communism fell, because actually they closed Red Square the second day I was there, because the uprising was getting started. But that was like some department store now. It was just with this massive grand staircase and all this stuff. But it's interesting to see all this old stuff.
That's one of the sad things about our country, is that we're just not that old.
Yeah. People go to Washington and see the buildings there and think, wow, this is some old history. Or they go to Williamsburg and think old stuff. But it's like you go to Europe and see some of this stuff. When I was stationed in Great Britain, I went to my friend's house. He rented a house in the little town just outside of the base, and I couldn't stand upright in it. I had to walk like this because the ceiling was only this tall. It was crazy. And then I was doing good, but then there's these these wooden beams that went through the middle, and I didn't catch that the first time. Well, I did catch it the first time, right in the forehead.
I went to a cemetery.
Oh, yeah.
And it was amazing to me, some of the stones from way.
Yeah.
And then they had some that were within the last 5 or 10 years of when I was standing.
Yeah.
So it was super, super old, and yet they were still using it.
Oh, yeah. I used to like doing that because we used to ride bicycles, me and a friend of mine, around our base, and we'd come across these old churches, and that's the first thing we do is start looking, see what the oldest tombstone we could find. And it's fascinating that they're still there. It's interesting. So, looking at the New Testament, we basically came to the determination when we used the secular historian's technique for determining if written history is valid, the Bible blew away everything. The New Testament blew away it all. So if you were to say the Bible is not, the New Testament's not a valid piece of history, then me telling you about my last birthday is also not a valid piece of history because there's less evidence in there as well. So since we looked at primarily the New Testament on all this evidence, what about the Old Testament? How can we determine that? Is actually pretty simple. Is if the New Testament is valid, that means Jesus is who he said he was. He was the Son of God. He is God himself. So we can look and see, what does Jesus say about the New Testament, to see how we can start comparing the New Testament. Old Testament. You're right. It's like, all right, so let's see. We'll go back to Dr. James White real quick to see what Jesus said about the...
They're astonished at his teaching. And so we focus upon that, and all of that is good. That's exactly what Jesus was saying. But in the process, we waltz right past one of the most amazing indications of Jesus' own view of the nature of Scripture in all of the Bible. And it's because we're actually following the argument. But that's why it's good to meditate on Scripture. That's why it's good to sort of slow down once in a while. I mean, I love the through-the-year Bible reading programs, but it doesn't leave a whole lot of time for meditation. So you might want to mix into that through a third of the Bible in a year or something like that, or through the Gospels in a year, something that would slow you down enough to allow you to actually concentrate. Because did you notice something really strange? Look back at verse 31. But regarding the resurrection of the dead, have you not read? Now, if I say read, I've written a few books. I'm way behind on the current one. I'd appreciate your prayers with that. It's co-authored with a Muslim. Yeah, a believing Muslim, a believing Christian, focusing upon what really separates Christianity and Islam. It's called the Trinity and Tawhid. And so working with another author who has things going on in his life and is traveling around the world like I am, it's going really, really slow. But when it comes out, it's going to be really unique. And that's what we're working on right now. But I've written over 20 books. And if I say to someone, have you not read, what's going to be the next phrase? What I wrote. That's not what it says. It says spoken. And so, have you not heard what I spoke to you? Those would be the natural pairs, right? But that's not what Jesus says. He says, have you not read what was spoken to you by God? And then he quotes from Exodus. Now, wait a minute. There may have been some old dudes there, but they're not that old. This is about 1,400 years earlier. Do you see what Jesus is saying? He is holding men accountable to the written word of God as if God himself spoke the words to that individual person 1,400 years later. Now that is amazing because it tells you what Jesus believed about the nature of Scripture. Yes, he can argue from the tense of a verb, and hence he himself knows that he has preserved his own word. But more than that, by using those two different words which normally don't go together, he communicates to us the very same thing that Paul communicates to us. Actually, what Paul's doing is he's just reflecting his master. I am so tired of how often Paul is attacked today. I deal with a lot of Muslims, and you want to know who the number one person they claim for messing up Christianity is? Paul. They detest Paul, but liberals detest Paul. I mean, Paul had it rough in his day, and I'm sort of glad he doesn't realize how rough he has it now. Because if he thought he was hated in his day, nothing comparison to what's out there now. Oh, man, does people go after him. So what he's actually doing is he is accurately reflecting his master and his Lord when he says, all Scripture is theopneustos. It is God-breathed. It is so intimate to God, it is like when you place your hand in front of your mouth while you're speaking, you cannot help but feel that breath that is right there, right? And some of you, it's right after lunch, so you're not wanting to do that. And so you're realizing, yeah, that's very intimate, and I don't want to go there. That's how intimate it is. And that's what the Scriptures are, is the very breath of God. They are God-breathed. That's the same thing that Peter said when he said, men spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. All of that is reflecting Jesus' own teaching. Have you not read what was spoken to you by God? You want direct revelation from God? Read the Bible. That's Jesus' view. That's Jesus' view. I would love to know what the Sadducees were thinking. They probably were a little bit taken aback by the "you're wrong and you're ignorant of the Scriptures" part at the beginning. Maybe they didn't hear the rest. I don't know. But then Jesus holds them accountable to divine revelation personally and directly over 1,400 years after the words were spoken. Which makes me wonder about many people in our land today who glibly take up the Bible to promote their various causes and to try to undercut the teaching of Scripture. I wonder what they're going to hear on the day of judgment. Did you not read what I spoke to you? That will be a very, very difficult day for many, many people. And so we have in the very words of Jesus an indication of what he believes regarding the nature of Scripture, that it is, in fact, God speaking.
So, as he said, Jesus is, if the New Testament is true, because the overwhelming evidence, so Jesus is who he said he was, Jesus' view of the Old Testament is that's God speaking to us, and we're held accountable to that. And here's a few locations where Jesus actually spoke about the New Testament. I know I'm not going to read them all. On the left side is, sorry?
You mean the Old Testament?
Yeah. I keep saying wrong thing. So on the left side, left column is Jesus speaking, referring to the Old Testament. On the right side is the Old Testament he's actually referring to. So there are several places where he does actually refer to the Old Testament. He never once said that the Exodus wasn't true. He never once said that Jonah and the whale wasn't true. He actually verified that. He never once said that the flood wasn't true. So he basically is, again, holding us accountable to the Old Testament. So that by verifying the New Testament, it's who Jesus said, who he said he was, we can easily verify the Old Testament on top of that, because Jesus is a much higher authority than the secular historians who are verifying the New Testament for us. Also, the Old Testament also verifies the New Testament through prophecies. And here's just a few that went through. There's some prophecies that people are like, well, you could have duplicated that. You could have read it and said, okay, we'll duplicate it. These are many that you can't duplicate. Here were the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem, which was prophesied 300 to 400 years prior to it actually happening. The Messiah will be born of a virgin, prophesied again 300 to 400 years before the event. The Messiah will enter Jerusalem triumphantly 500 years before the event. Go back one.
That one,
Yes.
we can actually go and look at the Dead Sea Scroll and see something that the document itself that was written prior to Jesus
Exactly.
being born. So we have that document from a proof standpoint.
Yeah. Well, I'm saying that they couldn't, like, Joseph and Mary could, because a lot of people are like, well, Joseph and Mary could have looked and said, oh, okay, because they live in Bethlehem and she's pregnant. They could have said, okay, hey, we can probably fulfill this prophecy. But there's things that they couldn't do beyond that. As far as us.
Get up to 53, and you have some problem.
Yeah, exactly. There's several things that go in there. But the Dead Sea Scrolls is a huge thing, like you said, because Joseph Smith, who said that the Bible was corrupted, and then when he said that in the 1830s, and then you go back and look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it verifies it. No, it's because all the same thing. And the Dead Sea Scrolls weren't discovered until after his death. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are a great thing for, especially some of these new attacks that keep coming up to say that the Bible's been changed. But then we had the Messiah will enter Jerusalem triumphantly 500 years before. There's no way you could fake that, how you get all the people in the town to go along with that. The Messiah will be betrayed by one of his followers. That one you probably could get one of you guys to fake, but if you're getting to fake it, why would he kill himself? Yeah, so it's a huge thing. If he can fake it, I betrayed you, and I'll go hide off to the side. You can pay me later. But then he goes and kills himself. So it's really not one you can fake on there. The Messiah will be betrayed by 30 pieces of silver. Here we're looking at another 500 years before the event. He'll be tried and condemned 500 years before the event. Oh, go ahead.
Go back to the 30 pieces.
Yeah.
It's more than just being betrayed by 30 pieces, because he tried to return it, and that's also in the Old Testament.
Oh, yeah. I think we'll jump in there, I think. And then he'll be smitten and spat upon 300 to 400 years before. He'll be mocked and taunted 1,000 years before. The Messiah will die by crucifixion with his hands pierced 1,000 years and 500 years before. And that's before crucifixion was even invented by the Romans. So that's another one. They had no, it's that form of punishment wasn't even invented yet. The Messiah will suffer with sinners 500 years before the event. The Messiah's garments will be divided by casting lots 1,000 years before the event. The Messiah bones will not be broken. That one, and then that one's bones won't be broken. It was common because that sped up the dying process. Because when they're hanging on the cross, when you hang on the cross, you die of suffocation.
Well, they did the other two guys.
Yeah, and they did the other two, but not him. And then probably about the numbers. And then so if it wasn't true, here's some of the things. Where are the counter arguments? And there's no known writings of antiquity that dispute any of the facts that are out there. Sir.
What I wanted to mention was that I realized about a month ago or something is Jeremiah 51:62, when the Lord said that he would destroy Babylon and neither people nor animals will remain there, and it will lie empty and abandoned forever.
Oh yeah.
So that's one saying free. No one still lives there.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's written back then, and I mean, who would ever be able to predict that something's going to be desolate forever?
Yeah, exactly.
And that right there, when I was listening to the Bible, I heard about a month ago, that was it just hit me, again, all the things just come up and hit you, and they're like, how can this be,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's another good. There's several more. Yeah, but that was just the few that I just picked out just for the time's sake. And then again, it would have been easier for Rome to just show, and the Jews to show that the Christians were wrong rather than hunt them down. And then of course the Romans using Josephus to write history, and Josephus, I'll show you where he refers to Christ and the Christians, and they wouldn't allow him to write something that was false. So when we look at it as a bio-reliable document, we looked at all the standards that the secular historians use and found out that it beats it all. So now we'll talk about external evidence. We'll get more, some of the external evidence we'll get into a bit more also when we talk about archaeology, but we'll look at external writing evidence real quick. So let me show you this quick video time.
Before you start, are
Sure.
there counter arguments? People that say the Bible isn't, what do they have for facts? Anything?
No, there's no works of antiquity that dispute all this.
So they come back and they can say, oh, the Bible's wrong, it's errors, this, that, and the other, and here's my proof.
Yeah, no, you have like modern day, and actually, modern day talking about like anywhere from the 1800s up, where you have people attacking Christianity, showing the errors in the Bible, like Darren was talking about. Then you show, well, here's we even showing it. We even put it out there, showing you that. But as far as for that time period, you would think, like for the Mormons, when we talk about them, there was, when Joseph Smith going on saying he's a prophet, he's doing all this stuff, there was actual people at that time period. I'll talk about the Kinderhook plates, where these guys specifically faked these things, made these plates to make them look like they're old, and gave them to the prophet. And he's like, oh yes, is this, and this is from whatever. And they're like, no, we just made those in the barn, about last week, just to prove he was wrong. And then there was several other points to where people actively went through, and there's writings showing where they're talking about Joseph Smith being wrong. But there's nothing in antiquity that goes and says, no, Jesus didn't perform all these miracles. He didn't rise from the dead. There's nothing really disputing that from that time period. And it would have been easier to do that than to try and hunt all these people down. Because you think if it was fake, and the people of that time period knew it was fake, because remember, the majority of people didn't join Christianity. There were several thousands that did, but the vast majority didn't join Christianity. So it would have been easier to be like, no, that's just not true. There's no reason to go hunt those people down and imprison them or kill them if it's not true. You just say, yeah, it's some cult, the same as we do today. It's like, oh yeah, there's this cult. We got Scientology. How many people are really worried about Scientology? I mean, it's like, yeah, okay, you guys knock yourself out. Hold your little tin cans and do, make your vibes better or whatever. But nobody really. It's like, yeah, we know that's not true, but nobody really cares about it.
During that time, I don't know exactly who it was, but one of the Pharisees stated when they were all meeting, just let Jesus go because so-and-so took a bunch of people out and you see nothing came of that. So if this is not of God, then it's going to...
Yeah, it disappear. Exactly. Exactly. All right.
From that time period, they wanted to disprove Christianity so bad. If they had anything written, any true evidence, that would be all over the world. It would be everywhere. Like any one of the scholars of that day would have wrote anything against and saying that Jesus wasn't real, that they faked it. They have proof. That would have been in books all over the world, so that they can rebuttal against the Bible right now.
Yeah.
And so
The religious leaders of the time started when they said to pay the guards to
say they fell asleep.
Say they fell asleep, and that his disciples came and took him away.
Yeah.
So they started the process.
And that was about it. But you think about how many times the Pharisees came and challenged him, tried to entrap him with things, and he just shut them down. And they had nothing to come back. You see, it seems like the Pharisees would have been the first ones to have all kinds of documents saying, because he was when they were really challenging him. He was challenging them by saying, you whitewashed tombs, you're going around doing all this stuff. You just, your mouths are open graves. It seems like they would have just went through and had all kinds of, compiled as much evidence as possible to shut that down. But there's nothing other than saying, yeah. And then again, that also is another thing. By telling these guards, tell them you fell asleep and they stole the body. Well, if you look at how the Roman military worked, if you failed at your mission, they killed you. That was a huge mission to guard that tomb, and they failed at it. So if the Romans were consistent, nobody would have heard from those guards ever again. But for somehow they're like, yeah, here, we'll pay you, and tell everybody they stole the body, which is a huge embarrassment for Rome. Why would they let that happen? So that little thing falls flat also when they say that.
Died quickly. I mean, you don't really hear it.
Oh, yeah. So let's look at some external evidence real quick for Jesus and see what this thing says real quick. Let's see, make sure. But the example I like to give is this book here is a story. Have you seen it? I think you've seen it too. This is basically the manuscripts of Zach and Cody, my two sons, and me walking the Florida Trail, hiking the Florida Trail, which goes from the Everglades up to Alabama. It's like 1,100 miles. So it talks about each day we went out, what we did each day, the experience we had. But if you go out there on the Florida Trail and you walk that entire Florida Trail, you're not going to find any physical evidence that we actually did it. So is this made up, you think? He says it is. It's easier for me to make it up than actually go out there and do it. So how can I prove this actually actually happened, other than me just writing it down to maybe get 15 minutes of fame.
Witnesses.
We can go with witnesses. There's 2 different newspaper articles that covered it. One covered us partway through, one covered the very end. The Florida Trail Association covered it in 4 or 5 of their magazines. There's people that we met, we saw. There's pictures that were taken. Of course, in Jesus' time, there's no photos to be taken. So, but we were walking with just backpacks on, and we would camp in a spot, and then we'd pick up everything we had, the next day, and we'd walk further. You think about Jesus and his disciples; they weren't traveling. They weren't going to hotels and whatnot. Well, they probably managed to stay at a couple places, a couple inns, but they were basically walking from point to point in this whole ministry. They didn't have a whole bunch of belongings that they had, so you wouldn't expect to find a whole bunch of physical evidence of them, other than witness accounts. So you got
So on your trip,
yes.
if you went to Darren's house and had ribs,
Which, by the way, if you haven't been to this food truck and had the ribs, a little plug.
If I could ever find it, I might do it.
Might be for sure. So.
And the garlic shrimp.
But my point is, if Darren then at some point wrote or documented, hey, I had these 3 guys came to my house and described them or said who they were or whatever, and we had dinner, and it was kind of neat. They were all from Florida or whatever. If he wrote that,
Yeah.
and then that document was preserved somewhere, and you had other people that you had met along the way, and they preserved their experience. Not saying that you were that special. That's not what I'm trying to get at.
They remember us more for our smell than anything.
In Jesus' case, there were a lot of people that were contemporary, maybe not totally contemporary, but relatively contemporary to Jesus, that documented their interactions with him
Yeah.
that weren't in the scriptures.
Yeah. And that's who they referenced some of them in that video. And that's how you go to them and look at some of that external evidence on there. For example, when here Tacitus was writing to Nero about the Christians, and then he wrote Christus, talking about Christ, from whom the name had its origins, suffered an extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of Pontius Pilate. So he's talking about how, because he was talking how Nero blamed the fire in Rome on the Christians, and he's referring to them there. You also had Pliny the Younger. In one of his letters, he's asking the emperor about how to handle a lot of these Christians because they're causing basically trouble. They didn't like them. So here, and what's weird is he's asking them. Basically, he's in one of his letters in AD 112. He asked Emperor Trajan's advice about the appropriate way to conduct legal proceedings against those accused of being Christians. Pliny says that he needed to consult the emperor about this issue because a great multitude of every age, class, and sex stood accused of Christianity. But here's what he said they were doing. They were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light. Then they sang alternate verses, a hymn to Christ as a god, and bound themselves by a solemn oath not to any wicked deeds, but never to commit any fraud, theft, adultery, never falsify their word, nor deny a trust when they should be called upon to deliver it up. After which it was their custom to separate and then reassemble, partake of food, but the food of an ordinary and innocent kind. Those were the troublemakers? They swore an oath not to do any wicked deeds, and that was the big problem of them, but they were following Christ. That Josephus, also he was the Jewish historian who wrote for the Romans. At one point he wrote that this talking about Jesus' brother. He says this James, says Josephus, was the brother of Jesus, the so-called Christ. There's another point in this Testimonium Flavium that he states about here. It says about the time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a wise man, for he wrought surprising feats. He was the Christ. When Pilate condemned him to be crucified, those who had come to love him did not give up their affection for him. On the third day he appeared, restored to life, and the tribe of Christians has not disappeared. There's a bunch of fillers that's in there. This, though, is disputed. Another thing where we'll tell you, hey, this is an issue that's disputed. Some people think that, and I believe it, that some a Christ follower at a later time altered this text because it's not consistent with what he wrote before. For him saying, if he ought to be called a man, he was the Christ. That doesn't make sense that he would write that if he talked about James following the so-called Christ. So to call him so-called at one point and saying he was Christ is inconsistent with Josephus. Also, putting there on the third day he appeared, restored to life, talking about the resurrection, that's not consistent for a Jewish man to agree with the resurrection. So most historians believe that these parts that are in yellow were added in at a later time by somebody wanting to make it a little more solid, that we have somebody talking about Christ and mention it in. But even if you take the yellow out and leave what they believe Josephus actually did write, you're still talking about he was a wise man, he did surprising feats, and Pilate condemned him and crucified him, and then the Christians didn't disappear. So he's still verifying Jesus in this writing, even though this part's disputed, the parts in yellow are disputed, because the rest of it's more consistent with his writing style. So I do believe with the others that this was these parts in yellow were probably added in just to try and make it a little more solid. I don't know. They don't know who might have done it, but and then Lucian of Samosata was a Greek satirist. He wrote, "The Christians worship a man to this day, the distinguished personages who they introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. He was impressed on them by their original lawgiver, that they're all brothers from the moment they were converted and deny the gods of Greece. They worship and crucify the sage to live after his laws." So another person who's verifying, basically talking about the Christians. Let me turn this down just a little bit for this next video, I think. If it's too loud, feel free to adjust that. It goes. So one thing that is also neat is there's in the gospel accounts in several places, also in the Bible, there's undesigned coincidences. This is actually a book that was written in 1851 by J.J. Blunt, Reverend J.J. Blunt, where he went through the Bible and found what's called undesigned coincidences. Undesigned coincidences are just statements that are made by one person. So you're telling a story, say about a car crash or whatever, and then you have certain parts of the story, but certain parts don't match up. You leave certain parts out, then you're talking about the car crash, and then things that you say and what you say, it kind of blends together. The example to kind of explain a little bit, this gentleman here, he was found dead in a tent on a Florida trail about 5 miles north of I-75. Some other hikers found him. He was in his tent. He had passed away. At that time, he only weighed like 89 pounds. He had like $3,600 in cash on him. He had some food with him and whatnot. But nobody knew who he was. He had no ID or anything on him. So what the authorities did is they figured, okay, this guy was obviously a hiker because by the equipment he had, he's off. He obviously did this as a serious hobby because he had some high-end equipment. So since they had no idea who he was, they put a notice in basically the Florida Trail Association, all the hiking things for the Florida Trail, the trail that he was on, hoping to get some information to try and figure out what, because the only thing they had was some other hikers were like, hey, we got to this campsite, this spot where, the campsite wasn't like a campground. It was just a location near the swamp because it was coming near the Everglades that was flat enough you can put a few tents, so they'll mark it on your map to say this is a place where you can set your tents up, you can have a level spot or whatnot. So they're like, we came across, we went to set our stuff up. There's another tent there. We assumed the guy was sleeping, and then he never made a sound to where we finally checked on and found he was dead. They knew nothing about him other than that. So they posted a thing in the magazines and in the blogs and internet or whatever. I happened to see it. Well, my daughter and I met him about a month before that. We were canoeing the Swanee River, and we stopped at a camping area alongside the Swanee River, and he was there. And he was, so he had told us that he was hiking. He started the Appalachian Trail up in Maine, and he went to hike all the way down to Key West, get a job for a little bit, and then go do some other adventure. We knew he goes by people have trail names, and normally you get your trail name by something you did, or some personality trait or whatever. His trail name was Mostly Harmless, and that's so I didn't know his real name. I knew his trail name was Mostly Harmless. That's what he told me. Our friend, Zachary's friend Charles, who's actually out with, his trail name's Cool Breeze, because he was going over a bunch of logs. Instead of stepping on them going over, he's kind of swing his legs over and slide off it. Well, one caught his britches and tore it all the way up the back. So he had this giant gaping hole all the way to the back. So we started calling him Cool Breeze. So that trail name stuck forever. But so now they have another piece of the puzzle, because now my testimony adds in, okay, now we know this guy was actually started further north. So then they started posting things along the Appalachian Trail, see if anybody knew him. And then some people were like, yeah, we saw this guy, he was doing this or whatever. So different testimonies eventually started putting this puzzle together. And they eventually found out that this guy, they found out who he was. He's from Louisiana, which nobody guessed. Everybody, even most of the hikers, thought he was from New York because of the way he talked and the stories he told. But by all these different stories and testimonies, they were able to put this puzzle together. Well, what's interesting is, and I didn't realize it until I saw that book, by the way, by J.J. Blunt. You can actually find reprints on Amazon you can get, or you can go to a website called archive.org, and you can download this for free, the actual book itself. The reprints are other people reprint, but you go through, and he did it for the Old and New Testament. He logged a lot of these different things where it put these puzzles together. So what I want to show you is Frank Turek from crossexamine.org. He basically talks about some of these undesigned coincidences. There's a lot that are in where the Gospels go with each other, and then some where some external accounts go. So I'll show you what some of these things are they're just kind of neat.
There are pieces.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Did they find out that the guy had a family?
Oh yeah. They found his family from New Orleans, or not New Orleans, but Louisiana, and then he basically was estranged from his family, and then was I think he was a software designer, and then he just quit his job and decided, I'm going to go do it. And what happens, he starved to death. Because when I saw him, that was one of the pieces of the puzzle, was also how he died. Because when I saw him up in North Florida along the Swanee River, he was telling me, he's like, I just like to go. Because following the Florida Trail, you follow there's these orange blazes that are on trees and back of signs. You just follow them along, and there's different way, the different design will tell you if there's a turn or whatnot. The Appalachian Trail, they're white markers. So technically, you don't need maps or anything. You just follow these markers and go. And that's what he would do. And the Appalachian Trail is there's a lot of supply points. There's a lot of places that help you, and a lot of people that help you along the Florida Trail, not so much. The Florida Trail is one of 11 National Scenic Trails. It's actually an official trail. But I told him, because he said he had no maps, no GPS. I just go. I'm a free bird. I just want to do what I want to do. At the time I met him, he was washing dishes and cleaning this little campsite for one of the volunteers there, and she was basically feeding him, and then she'd give him a couple bucks. So he was staying there for a couple nights, and then he was moving on.
Did you say early on that when they found him, he had food with him?
Yeah. Not too much food, but some food with him. And most starving people, because what I told him was, I said, Florida Trail is not like the Appalachian Trail. Once you get south of Orlando, the supply points practically disappear. It's very hard to find supplies south of Orlando. But he's like, oh, no, I'll do it. And I said, hey, man, I would recommend when you get to Gainesville, go get a map, because the Florida Trail headquarters is there. I said, get a map, bare minimum, so you can see where the supply points are. But he didn't do that. because when they found him, he still had no maps or anything. So what happened, once he got south of Orlando, he probably started realizing, yeah, there's no towns, there's no supply points or whatever. So he was basically rationing. Most people who starve like on mountaintops and things like that, they normally have food with them, but they're trying to ration it off because they don't want to eat it all right now because they know I don't know how many days I'll be wandering. So they'll try and ration it out. But then for him, he's out there in the heat and all that, but he's losing weight, and eventually his body just gave up, but he still had some food available. The sad thing was, had he had a map, he would have realized he's 5 miles where he died. He was 5 miles from the I-75 rest stop, which is one of the big points that people resupply before they go into the swamp. So he was 5 miles from getting help. And if he had a map, I'm certain he would have made that last 5 miles. Or he had the food where he could have gave himself the energy to make the last 5 miles. So it was pretty sad that he went. And there's a gentleman that posted a thing on a website where they were trying to find him, and I added to that as well. But that's just one of the little things. But yeah, they did notify his family. But let me show you Frank Turek.
There are pieces of a puzzle that are found in each one of the 4 Gospels. That one Gospel brings up a puzzle piece and the other Gospel answers. And sometimes this Gospel brings up the puzzle piece and this Gospel answers. And when you look at this, you realize that these are 4 eyewitness accounts that couldn't have been invented. There's no way they could have invented these accounts. Here's why. Lying just below the surface of the New Testament narrative is an elaborate series of interlocking puzzle pieces that reveal that the New Testament documents contain independent eyewitness testimony of actual historical events. Because details in one writer's account inadvertently, they're like passing details, inadvertently fill in the gaps of another writer's account. So when you compare the accounts, you see how puzzling statements and events are resolved to reveal a more complete picture of what actually happened. When you put all the puzzle pieces together, you can see the picture. And that's one reason we have 4 accounts. As we'll see later, if it was just one account, inevitably we'd be missing some details. And of course, 4 independent accounts are more trustworthy than just one. Because if you just have one, who knows if the guy's lying? But if you have 4 independent accounts telling basically the same core story with varying details, you go, this really happened. Now, years ago, I mentioned J.J. Blunt. He was a Cambridge professor and also a pastor. He wrote a book on what he called undesigned coincidences in the text. What we're about to show you are called undesigned coincidences. I don't like that phrase because it doesn't really mean anything. I like to call it elaborate testimony. But you'll see as we go through this. And we're going to go through so much of this that in a couple of days, if you want this PowerPoint presentation, if you go to this website, crossexamine.org/TV, and put your email address in, I'm going to email you this particular PowerPoint presentation in PDF form. That goes for all the people watching online too. So just go to that website. All right, let's do a bunch of these because they're extremely interesting. And they show, without any doubt in my mind, that these are independent eyewitness accounts. Let's start with Jesus and Pilate. Jesus and Pilate. Jesus is actually accused of sedition. And if you go to Luke, he leaves a puzzle. Here's what he says. The Jews accused Jesus before Pilate. We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar and saying that he himself is Christ the King. And Pilate asked him, are you the King of the Jews? And Jesus answered him, you have said so. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and crowds, I find no guilt in this man. Now, does anyone see anything puzzling about this? What's puzzling about it? The charge is brought before him. Pilate asks, is it true? Jesus says yes. And then he says, you're not guilty. Does anyone see anything puzzling about this? Yeah. Well, it seems like he did. You have said so. He didn't deny it, right? Well, if you weren't, wouldn't you deny it? Wouldn't you say, no, I'm not the King of the Jews? Right? He at least didn't deny it. So my question is, why did he find him not guilty? At least he would have said, well, you need to answer it directly, right? Because Jesus didn't deny it. Now, this is puzzling, right? You just look at Luke's account and you go, what's going on here? Well, John actually answers. He has the missing puzzle piece that solves Luke. If you read John's version, it says, Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. Pilate went back outside to the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. Do you see the conclusion Pilate came to? What's the conclusion he came to? Yeah, he's a king, but he's not a king that's going to threaten me. He's not a king that's going to threaten Caesar, because that was their charge. And so he said, well, I find no guilt in this man. If you've got a problem with him, you handle him. Now, you wouldn't know that if you just read Luke. But when you read John, John fills in the missing puzzle piece. Now, this tells me that these are two independent eyewitness accounts that contain different details. When you did your 9/11, you contained certain details that you did include. And you included certain details that you didn't include, and vice versa, right? We all had different details. And when you put the stories together, we get a more complete picture. Not a totally complete picture. There's no account that has every detail, right? There's no account that could. But a more complete picture. So the bottom line is when you have these four Gospels here, John actually solves Luke. Now let's take a look at another one. This is Herod Antipas. He was called a fox by Jesus. Now this is the guy that beheaded John the Baptist and also the guy that tried Jesus. Remember, they brought Jesus before Herod. Well, there was a Herod the Great who died in 4 BC. So he dies about the time Jesus is born. After he dies, his kingdom is broken up. And one of his sons got part of the kingdom. This guy, Herod Antipas. So when you read Herod in the Bible, most of the time it's one of these guys. Although early on, Matthew says Herod the Great, that's his father. But this is the guy that dealt with John the Baptist and dealt with Jesus. And Jesus called him a fox. Now the question is, how does Matthew know what that fox is saying privately? Why? Notice in Matthew, he says that at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him. So Herod turns to his servants and says, this guy Jesus, he's John the Baptist just raised from the dead. Now, what's the puzzle?
How did he hear what the servant said?
That's right, Josh. How does he know? How would Matthew know what Herod said to his servants? Now, you could say, well, God revealed it to him, right? Of course, you could say that, but you don't even need to go there. Why not? Because another writer has the missing puzzle piece. If you go to Luke, Luke says, and the 12 were with Jesus. This is a totally unrelated passage. It has nothing to do with Herod, really. It has nothing to do with this instance. The 12 were with Jesus, and certain women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities, Mary called Magdalene, out of whom had come 7 demons. Gee, there's a great eyewitness for you, right? And Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward. And Susanna and many others who provided for him from their substance. So one of the women following Jesus, who also had Matthew following him, was the wife of Herod's steward. So do you think that Joanna maybe told Matthew, this is what Herod is saying? Makes sense, right? But you wouldn't know that by just reading Matthew. So now, not only do you have John affirming Luke, now you've got Luke solving Matthew. All right? Let's do another one. Why do you keep the transfiguration quiet? What goes on with the transfiguration? Anyone know the story of the transfiguration? Jesus appears with who? Moses and Elijah. He takes 3 of the apostles up on a mountain, and he says, watch this! And then suddenly they're in this glorified state, Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. And it's funny, if you read Peter, you see his personality coming out in this instance. Because they go up to this mountain, and then he sees this amazing event. And what does Peter say? Lord, it's good that we're here. That's what he says. I mean, that's what you say when you see something amazing like that? Lord, it's good that we're here. That's just open mouth and say something, right? Okay. Well, here's right after the transfiguration. Here's what happened. Luke leaves a puzzle. He says, and they kept silent and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. They didn't say anything about what. Now, if it were you, after seeing that, would you just not tell anyone? You'd have to tell everybody, wouldn't you? So the puzzle here, of course, is why would they keep silent about this amazing event? Well, Mark solves Luke. And as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So what really happened here is Mark gives us the command but doesn't say whether they obeyed it, whereas Luke records their obedience but omits the command. Luke just leaves the command out and tells them they didn't say anything. Mark says don't tell anybody, but he doesn't say whether or not they told anyone. So again, this is independent testimony of the same event, but Luke is giving one detail, Mark's giving another detail. When you put them together, you got a more complete story. So, not only does John solve Luke, Luke solves Matthew, but also Mark solves Luke. All right, you're getting to see a little network going on here, right? All right, how about this one? What miracles were done in Bethsaida? Now, Bethsaida is a little town just in the north of the Sea of Galilee. Jerusalem's way down here. North of the Sea of Galilee. Here's Bethsaida. Capernaum's one of my favorite towns to go to, but when you go to Capernaum, we'll see a little bit later, you actually stood where Jesus stood. And there's a bunch of other towns. Here's a new town. Well, I don't know how new it is. It's newly discovered synagogue in Magdala, which is where Mary Magdalene is from. And you got Tiberias right here. In any event, the Sermon on the Mount is right about in this area, just north of Capernaum. And Bethsaida is supposed to have a miracle done there. And here's what Matthew says about the miracle. He records Jesus pronouncing the following judgment. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. Now here is the puzzle right here. The puzzle is this. What mighty works have been done in Bethsaida? Matthew doesn't record Jesus doing any. So it's kind of a mystery as to, well, why would they repent? They haven't seen any miracles. Matthew, what are you talking about? Well, as you could imagine, there's going to be an answer to this, but in order to get the answer, we got to go to number 5. We're going to come back to number 4. This is a great mystery here. This is the feeding of the 5,000. And Jesus asks Philip where to get food. You say, so what? You'll see why here in a minute, why this is kind of a mystery. John leaves a puzzle. At the feeding of the 5,000, John records Jesus asking Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? Now, why is that a puzzle? Other than, well, Jesus is going to do a miracle. He doesn't need to ask them. But forget that for a second. Why would that be a puzzle if you're reading that? At least a little bit of a question. You'd go, Philip? What do you think?
He's not the treasurer?
Yeah, he's not the treasurer. In fact, he's not really anybody big. If you want to feed 5,000 people, who might you ask?
Judas?
Well, Judas, maybe he has the money, right? Peter, the fisherman, or John, right? One of the more prominent leaders. So the puzzle for me is, why is Jesus asking Philip, a minor character, about where to get a lot of money and food, instead of asking a leader such as Peter and John? Right? You got a big problem here. You're not going to talk to a guy who isn't really a leader. You're probably going to talk to somebody who could probably get something done, right? Like Peter, the fisherman, or John, or somebody like that. Somebody who's already proved him or herself. Well, what's the solution? The solution is that Luke has the missing puzzle piece that solves John. And this is kind of an intricate one. Luke, and only Luke, mentions that Bethsaida was the location of the feeding of the 5,000. You say, so what? Who's from Bethsaida? John, in other contexts, tells us that Philip is from Bethsaida. Now, suddenly, it's starting to make sense, right? What sense is it making? John and Luke interlock to help us solve the puzzle. Jesus is asking Philip because he's from Bethsaida. It's like if I came to your town and a whole bunch of people needed to get fed, I'm asking you where to get the food, right? You don't ask John or you don't ask Peter. They're not from there. So now you're going, I get it. We wouldn't know that from John alone. Luke tells us the who, John tells us the who, while Luke tells us the where. Thus, the accounts are complementary. So, not only does John affirm Luke, and Luke solves Matthew, and Mark solves Luke, now you've got Luke solving John. So you have John solving Luke earlier, now you got Luke solving John. They're interlocked. They're interlocked. Now let's go back to the one we were at. What miracle was done in Bethsaida? The feeding of the 5,000. But Matthew doesn't mention the feeding of the 5,000 until chapter 14. Why? Because his gospel is arranged thematically rather than chronologically. Matthew's not giving you a chronological account. He's giving you a thematic account. So if you're just reading along, you'd go, well, wait a minute, I haven't heard about any miracle in Bethsaida. Why is Jesus getting all judgmental against Bethsaida? He hadn't done any miracles there. In fact, one of the reasons that Luke may have written this in the opening verses of his gospel, he said, I asked people about this. He essentially interviewed eyewitnesses because I wanted to write an orderly account for you, O excellent Theophilus. Why do you think he's writing orderly? Maybe because the other accounts weren't necessarily orderly. They were more thematic, like Matthew. So these interlocking puzzle pieces from Luke, John, and Matthew, can you get the complete picture? You've got three Gospels now interacting on this one issue or this one event. So not only do you got Luke affirming, or John affirming Luke, and Luke affirming Matthew, and Mark affirming Luke, and Luke affirming John, now you've got Luke affirming Matthew again. Oh, one other thing about Bethsaida. It's actually been discovered, they think it's been discovered anyway, that this is a picture from an archaeological shot of Bethsaida right here. They have a fisherman's house, they think, right here. And they also have a live fish tank, this woman coming out of it. And these are the references to Bethsaida here in the New Testament. Philip, Andrew, and Peter spent some time there, but Philip is really from there. And John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all talk about Bethsaida. But only when you piece together this story from all sorts of different points in these four Gospels do you get the complete picture as to what's going on, which is like reviewing the four different stories of 9/11 to try and get a more complete picture as to what is going on. But we're not done with the feeding of the 5,000. Guys, who's been to Israel? Okay, just a couple of us. We're going back to Israel in the summer of 2016, and we normally go about June or so. We're going to lead a group there, and this is the kind of grass you see in June. Okay, the weather's very similar to Southern California, maybe a little hotter than Southern California, but in terms of the rain cycle, it rains pretty much. They get most of their rain in November. December's their wettest month, then a little bit in January. It really starts drying out. By the time April rolls around, they don't get rain for most of the summer. So they go April, May, June, July, August, September, October, like no rain. So, you know, if you get too much past the spring, this is what you're going to get. But Mark creates a puzzle about this, or leaves a puzzle. Jesus said to them, come away. This is all the context of the feeding of the 5,000. He says, come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while. So you got to get to a desolate place before he's going to feed them. And he says, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. Then he commanded them all to sit down in groups on the green grass. That's kind of a extra little detail. Why would you say that? Why would you just say grass? Sit down on the grass. No, it says green grass. Well, here is the puzzle in this one. Grass in Galilee is rarely green, okay? Maybe early on in the spring it is, but then after that, it's not. It looks like that. So where do we get some resolution here? You get some resolution by going to John, because John says that this happened at the Passover. When does the Passover occur? It occurs in the spring. In other words, the week just before and after the growing season in Palestine is when this occurred, hence the green grass. Also during Passover, the roads would be clogged with people. That's why he says, let's get to a desolate place. Let's get off the streets. Let's sit down here in the green grass so we can meet. And then he feeds them. Now, you don't get this from one gospel, right? This is all interlocked. It's obvious these are not all copied from one another. And it's obvious that each account has some detail, eyewitness detail, that maybe the other account didn't include. They're all eyewitnesses. So not only does John solve Luke, and Luke solves Matthew twice, Mark solves Luke, and Luke also solves John, but now you've got John solving Mark. How many have ever been to Capernaum? You ever been to Capernaum? This is the gate you walk through when you get into the town. It's that town I mentioned earlier, right at the top of the Sea of Galilee. I love this place because there's so much that goes on in Capernaum. And when you go to Capernaum, the areas of the Bible that Capernaum is in, or that the Bible talks about when it talks about Capernaum, they just come to life. You can see everything because it's a very small area. Jesus went from the synagogue. He saw Peter's house. There's Peter's house. Well, it didn't look like this then. Yes, he had quite a spot. He was a 3 diamond in Amway or something. I don't know what he was, but no. This church is a Catholic church that was built, say, 20, 30 years ago, over the site of what is thought to be Peter's house. You see these bricks right here? These bricks are surrounding an archaeological area, and when you go sit in this church, it has a see-through floor, basically. So it's like a plexiglass floor that you can look through and see the remains of Peter's house. There's archaeological reasons to believe that this was Peter's house in the 1st century. And the sea is that way. So if you walked through under the house and kept going, you'd wind up in the sea. You're right there on the shore. And if you go to the left over here, you'll see a synagogue, the remains of a synagogue. We'll get to that here in a minute. But in any event, what happened at this place to Jesus was that Matthew says that Jesus entered Peter's house, and he saw his mother-in-law lying sick with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her. And she rose and began to serve him. That evening they brought to him many who were oppressed by demons, and he cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick. Okay, what's the puzzle here? Yeah, what's that evening? What's the deal with that? I don't know about you, but if Jesus is healing people, why am I waiting till the evening? He may leave, right? If he does this during the day, and then I wait like 5 hours till evening comes, he may be gone. I'm going over there now if I'm sick, right?
Unless it's the Sabbath.
Unless it's the Sabbath. But Matthew doesn't tell us it's the Sabbath. Who tells us it's the Sabbath? Mark solves Matthew. On the Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and immediately he left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law, ill with a fever. That evening at sundown, they brought to him all who were sick or oppressed by demons. Now you've got another account giving you more information that solves the puzzle in the first account. In fact, not only does John affirm Luke, and Luke affirm John, and Luke affirms Matthew twice, Mark affirms Luke, and John affirms Mark. Now you got Mark solving Matthew. You can see how this is going. We're getting quite a network here of interlocking evidence. Now, one other thing, this is my youngest son, Austin, and I. This is at the synagogue I mentioned. This synagogue is probably 50 yards from Peter's house. If you're standing looking at Peter's house to the south, The seas behind Peter's house. To the left, 50, maybe 100 yards, couldn't be much more than that, is this synagogue. And you can see there's a little bit of the background. This white synagogue that we're in, I say white because this was the synagogue built in the 4th century. See this sign right here? It says, the late 4th century AD white synagogue, built upon the remains of the synagogue of Jesus, which is this basalt color. So in the 4th century, they put this white synagogue above the synagogue in which Jesus healed people. We know where that was. It's right there. You can go there and see it and stand there. Finally, one more. Number 8. How many times have you heard people trying to explain when Jesus asks John, do you love me? Do you love me more? You remember that at the end of the book of John? Well, here's what John says. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Now, the puzzle here, for me anyway, is why does Jesus ask Peter whether he loves him more than the others do? Well, he did deny him 3 times, but what did Peter say long before then? You're not going to get it from John. You got to go over to Matthew, because Matthew solves John. Peter answered him, though they will all fall away because of you, I will never fall away. So Matthew records, though John does not, Peter's boast that he was the most faithful of Jesus' disciples. So Jesus, after all this has occurred, asks them, so do you love me more than these? You said you wouldn't fall away. You don't get it from one. You got to get it from the other to fill in the detail. So not only does John solve Luke and Luke solve John, and Luke solves Matthew twice, Mark solves Luke, John solves Mark, Mark solves Matthew, Matthew solves John. There's no way this is an invented story. You couldn't do this. This is too obscure. All these details, you got to look all over the place to try and put them all together. You need the box top to the puzzle. This is putting together an amazing puzzle. So, what kind of conclusions can we draw from this? I think that fictions and forgeries aren't like this. For example, why leave loose ends or raise puzzling questions if you're trying to pass off a lie as the truth, right? There's so many puzzling questions when you look at this. You go, look, if they were really trying to pass off a lie as the truth, they wouldn't let this happen. They would answer all these puzzling questions. Secondly, how can you control what other people will write to make it interlock with what you've written? You can't control. In fact, we'll see next week, not only does this happen internally between the Gospels, there are writers outside the Gospels that interlock with the Gospels, like Josephus and Suetonius and Tacitus. These Jewish and Roman writers. They're writing stuff that interlocks with the New Testament writers. They're called external undesigned coincidences. These are internal undesigned coincidences. Also, this is what actual history, it seems to me, is like. The New Testament writers obviously didn't copy from one another. If they did, if they copied from one another, the accounts would be all the same, right? There wouldn't be these inconsistencies. Passing details interlock in authentic, detailed records told by different people who saw the same real events or knew those that did. Now, do you remember my friend Jim Wallace, who was in here last December? The cold case homicide detective who's been on Dateline 4 times for solving cold case murders that are 30 years old. Well, he wrote a book called Cold Case Christianity, where he looks at eyewitness details. He's great at eyewitness testimony because that's what he does for a living. In fact, he and I do several seminars together now. But in this book, he writes about this way. He says, the early believers could have destroyed all but one of the accounts, changed the conflicting details, or simply harmonized the Gospels, but these diverse accounts were preserved as they are because they are true. They display all the earmarks we would expect in true eyewitness testimony. If the early church had eliminated the 4 eyewitness perspectives and limited us to one tidy version, we would inevitably miss some significant detail. So this is exactly what you expect when you have eyewitnesses. You all agree on the same story. You may disagree over the details, but when you look at the details together, then you can figure out a more complete picture. And sometimes the details appear to be contradictory. In fact, go back to the Titanic. Did I ever tell you the Titanic story? When the Titanic sank in 1912, some of the survivors said the Titanic went down whole. Other survivors said it broke in two before it went down. What did they all agree on? It went down. What did they disagree on? A detail, how it went down. Now, are we to say, well, since they disagreed on how it went down, we can't believe the Titanic sank? No, of course not. That's what they all agree on. The same thing is true in the New Testament documents. The New Testament documents all agree on what? Jesus died and rose again. They may disagree, at least it appears anyway, on who got to the tomb first, how many angels were at the tomb, these kind of details, but they all agree on the resurrection, the death, burial, and resurrection. They're not inventing this. They're just doing what eyewitnesses do. Now, by the way, there's a difference between a contradiction and a difference. Differences are not always contradictions. So you just got to look at each one of them and see if they are contradictory or if they're just different. Now, again, just to remind you, but what my goal in this presentation is just to give you so many of these things that you walk out of here going, yeah, it's obvious. These documents are telling the truth. There's no way they could have invented this. So let's do one more internal between the Gospels, and then we're going to do 4 or 5 external. What I mean by that is writers outside the Gospels telling us that what the Gospels are saying is true. All right, let's do one more. Number 9. Who hit you? Matthew leaves a puzzle. What's the puzzle? Jesus is being whipped. He's being beaten. And it says, then the high priest tore his clothes after Jesus said, I am, because I am is an indication he's the Messiah. And so the high priest tears his clothes and says, blasphemy. He says, why do we need any more witnesses? Look, now you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? He's worthy of death, they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fists. Others slapped and said, prophesy to us, Christ. Who hit you? The puzzle is, why are they asking who hit you? He can see them. They're standing right in front of him. They're slapping him, and they're asking prophecy, who hit you? It's a mystery. Why would Matthew leave this puzzle if he's inventing this? Well, you have to go over to Luke because Luke solves Matthew. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded prophecy, who hit you? And they said many other insulting things to him. So you get the blindfold part from Luke. Matthew leaves that out. That's just not a detail he includes. Yet they're obviously witnessing the same event, right? They come and put it together. Actually, Luke is interviewing eyewitnesses. He's not an eyewitness of this, but he's getting data that helps clarify what Matthew has said. Now, you might expect Luke, he's doing research on this. Maybe he has access to Matthew's account, and he goes, yeah, why is he saying prophecy why are they saying prophecy when Jesus can see them right before them? And then he interviewed somebody and said, oh yeah, Jesus was blindfolded. Oh, let me put that detail in there. That'll clear it up, right? So, in addition to all these connections, we again have Luke verifying Matthew. Let's look at some interlocking puzzle pieces from non-Christian writers. This is sometimes called extra-biblical writers or extra-biblical testimony. So these aren't people writing in the Bible. These are people like Josephus and Tacitus and Suetonius. These are writers who lived around that time who are giving us details about that era. And let's start in Matthew. Why avoid Herod Archelaus? Who is Archelaus? Archelaus is one of the sons of Herod the Great. When Herod the Great died in 6 BC, his kingdom was divided up, and one of his sons was Archelaus. And Archelaus got the section of the kingdom that included Jerusalem. And so he was the ruler from 4 BC to about 6 AD, so about 10 years. And as you read Matthew, he leaves a puzzle, because here's what Matthew records, that Joseph had a dream in Egypt to return to Israel with Mary and the child Jesus. But when Joseph heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Having been warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee, and he went and lived in a town called Nazareth. Now, Galilee is to the north in Israel, and of course, Jerusalem is the area whereby Archelaus is in charge, or where Archelaus is in charge. There is no explanation as to who Archelaus is. There's no explanation as to why Joseph would want to avoid this area. So it seems to me the puzzle is this: why is Archelaus so scary? Somebody not in the Bible tells us. In fact, this man is the greatest Jewish historian of the time. His name is Titus Josephus. He lived from 37 AD to 100 AD. And he was one of the rebels against the Romans in 66 AD when the Jews tried to boot the Romans out. That did not end well, because what happened in 70 AD? The temple in the entire country basically was overrun by the Romans, and the temple has not been rebuilt to this day. So when Jesus says to them in Matthew chapter 24 that not one stone will be left upon another, and then they ask him, well, when are these things going to occur? And he says, before this generation passes away, these things are going to occur. He says, you will see the Son of Man coming in power on the clouds. And everyone's thinking that's a reference to the end of the world. No, it's not. It's a reference to 70 AD. He said that in 30 AD. What's a generation? 40 years. 40 years later, 70 AD, the Roman army descends upon Jerusalem, and they wipe out Jerusalem. They wipe out the temple. Josephus said there was nothing left. Now, what's all this business about coming in the clouds? What could you see? By the way, Jerusalem's elevated. What could you see from 100 miles if an army was coming on Jerusalem? A cloud of dust. In fact, in the Old Testament, in Isaiah 19, it says Yahweh rides a cloud of judgment against Egypt. The reference to the clouds is the army coming. Jesus is saying that Jerusalem would be judged because they rejected the Messiah within a generation. And there it was. This guy talks about it in a couple of works that he has done. One is called Antiquities. And here's what he says about Archelaus. Matthew doesn't explain, but the Jewish historian Josephus does in putting out a disturbance at the temple in 4 BC, so he's just taken over. Archelaus sent in troops into the temple and slaughtered 3,000 Jews. Passover that year was canceled. He tries to assert his authority as soon as he takes over. He murders 3,000 Jews. They cancel Passover. A whole bunch of Jews are probably going back on the road toward Egypt. And Joseph and Mary and the baby Jesus are on their way back going, where are you guys going? Isn't it Passover? Archelaus, haven't you heard? He just slaughtered 3,000 of our brethren. Passover's been canceled. So what's Joseph doing? I'm not going to where that homicidal maniac is. I just left that area to escape a homicidal maniac. His father, I'm not going back there. I'm going to go to Galilee. Right? But you don't get that from the Bible. You get that from Josephus. And Josephus is writing about 40 years after this. So here comes an outside source, Josephus, and he says Matthew is reliable. Next one, number 2. Why did they take Jesus to the temple when he was 12? Why not 10? Why not 11? In fact, if you look at Luke, he raises a question. It says every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover. Every year. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the feast according to the custom, and they took Jesus with them. And you know the rest of the story. He's found in the temple after they... And by the way, isn't this just like about 12-year-old kids? You know, when you go in a group with their friends, you're thinking, well, their parents are watching them. And their parents are thinking, well, you're watching his kid, you know. And somehow Jesus gets left out of the whole gaggle. And he's in the temple and nobody notices it until they're halfway home. Where's Jesus? I thought he was with you. No, I thought he was with you. Where is he? And they go back and they find him in the temple. But why would they go down there when he's 12? Why not 11? Why not 10? Why not 13? Why 12? And why did his parents go without him until 12? Again, Josephus may answer the question. In the 10th year of Archelaus' government, both his brethren and the principal men of Judea and Samaria, not being able to bear his barbarous and tyrannical usage of them, accused him before Caesar. Caesar, upon hearing what certain accusers of his had to say and what reply he could make, banished Archelaus to a city in Gaul, which is present-day France. So the people basically rebelled against Archelaus by going to Caesar and saying, this guy's a psycho. We want somebody else. And so they hear all this. Caesar does, and he says, Archelaus, what do you have to say for yourself? Apparently Archelaus did not do a good job in defense. You're gone. He took all his property from him, sent him to France. What year was that? That's about the time Jesus would have been 12. You say, wasn't Jesus born in 0? First of all, there's no 0 year, okay? But no, the way the calendar goes, he was born around 6 BC, sometime between 4 and 6 BC, okay? So why did they bring him when he's 12? Because Archelaus is gone. Archelaus is no longer a threat. So they avoided bringing Jesus into Archelaus' territory when Archelaus was there. As soon as they figured out that Archelaus is gone, he's deposed, he's in France, I guess it's safe to take the boy down to Jerusalem. Let's go. Now, is that a little bit of speculation? Yeah, but it's quite interesting, isn't it? In fact, now you've got Josephus also now verifying Luke. How about number 3? Why did Claudius order the Jews out of Rome? You're reading through the book of Acts in Acts chapter 18, and suddenly you read something, Claudius expelled all the Jews from Rome. And you'll go, where did this come from? Okay. He's the Roman emperor from 41 to 54 AD. And here's what we learn in Luke. He leaves a puzzle. Luke, of course, writes the book of Acts, and right after Paul is on Mars Hill, and he comes down off Mars Hill in Athens, it says, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth, and he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, parenthetically, because Claudius commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. So Aquila and Priscilla got booted out of Rome. Why? Because Claudius booted all the Jews out of Rome. But why? Who is Claudius and why did he command the Jews to leave Rome? Suetonius helps solve this. Who's Suetonius? Suetonius is a Roman historian writing about the 12 Caesars. So there were 12 Caesars that he's writing about, and one of the Caesars he's writing about is Claudius. There's a whole book on Claudius. And here's what it says in the book. Because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, he expelled them, Claudius did, from the city. Who is Chrestus? That's another word for Christ. And he, who's he? That's Claudius. Expelled them, meaning the Jews. And then from the city, that's what Luke says in Acts chapter 18, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. So here you have a Roman historian just parenthetically verifying what Luke has written. Are Luke and Suetonius somehow in cahoots together? No. Luke is writing prior to 62 AD, or about 62 AD, maybe before that. Suetonius is writing in about 117 AD. So they're, 50-something years apart. They don't even know each other. But they're given details that interlock. So what's the disturbance? We don't know what the disturbance was, but it could be because, of course, the Jews didn't like the Christians claiming that Jesus is the Messiah, and wherever Paul went, he got into trouble, he got into fights and everything, and apparently the church at Rome may have caused some commotion with the Jews or vice versa. Of course, that's one of the reasons Paul writes the book of Romans, right? He's writing to the church there at Rome. So all this fits together like a jigsaw puzzle. Now, you've got Josephus. Now you also have Suetonius, and he's verifying what Luke says because Luke has written Acts. How about Herod? Did Herod really kill John the Baptist? What's the story of John the Baptist? How does he get killed? Herod Antipas, that's this guy. He's the son of Herod the Great, beheaded John the Baptist. This is the guy that Christ stood before. Okay, he beheaded John the Baptist. Why? What did John do that Herod's, this guy, wife didn't like?
Discuss their extramarital arrangement.
Yes. Here's what this guy did. He liked his stepbrother's wife. So he got his stepbrother's wife to marry him. And John the Baptist said, that's an illegitimate marriage. And she didn't like it. So when her daughter, Salome, danced for Herod, he said, I'll give you anything you want up to half my kingdom. And she said, because her mother said in her ear, Tell Herod I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And so he couldn't go back on his word. He sent the executioner and cut off John's head in prison and brought it to her. Now, how do we even know this name Salome? Is it in any of the Bible? Any of the Bible anywhere? No, you know what it tells us who the name is? Josephus. Josephus tells. There's another verification. All right. So, did he really kill John the Baptist? We know that Mark, Luke, Matthew all say yes. Here's Mark's account. The king, Herod Antipas, was greatly distressed, but because of his oath and dinner guests, he did not want to refuse her, so he immediately sent an executioner with orders to bring John's head. The man went, beheaded John in the prison, and brought back his head on a platter. He presented it to the girl, and she gave it to her mother. Can you imagine that? Isn't that kind of brutal? Here, Mom. Here he is. Now, what does Josephus say about him? Josephus, writing 40 or so years later. Now, some of the Jews thought that the destruction of Herod's army came from God, and that very justly as a punishment of what he did against John, that called the Baptist. For Herod killed him, who was a good man, and commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness towards one another and piety towards God, and so to come to baptism. So here you got John the Baptist being spoken of by Josephus. Now, is there any way Luke, Mark, or Matthew could have had Josephus 40-something years later write about this? They don't even know this guy. They're dead already. So, now you have Josephus verifying the John the Baptist account. The John the Baptist account appears in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Let me just point out that there's another section in the book called Extra Biblical Testimony, and it overlaps with elaborate testimony. And what we're saying here is the basic New Testament storyline is confirmed by non-Christian sources. Who are the non-Christian sources? We've seen some of them. There are 10 ancient non-Christian sources within 150 years of Jesus' life. Some of them are historians like Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, Thallus, Phlegon. We just mentioned the first three. Also, government officials like Pliny the Younger, Emperor Trajan, Emperor Hadrian. They mentioned something about Jesus, and other sources, including the Jewish Talmud and the Greek writer Lucian. And when you combine these sources, or these references, they're very brief references. You saw the reference to John the Baptist and Josephus. They're very brief references. When you combine all these references together, here is the story that you can construct about Jesus. Jesus lived during the time of Tiberius Caesar. Again, this is all from non-Christian sources, okay? He lived a virtuous life. He was a wonder worker. He had a brother named James. He was acclaimed to be the Messiah. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate. An eclipse and an earthquake occurred when he died. He was crucified on the eve of the Passover. His disciples believed he rose from the dead. His disciples were willing to die for their belief. Christianity spread rapidly as far as Rome, and his disciples denied the Roman gods and worshiped Jesus as God. Now, does anyone notice anything about this list of facts here? This is what the New Testament says, right? It's the same story, but this is from non-Christian sources. Now, notice these non-Christian sources don't say they believe Jesus rose from the dead. Otherwise, they'd be Christians. But these non-Christian sources are saying his disciples believed he rose from the dead, and his disciples were willing to die for their belief. And Christianity spread rapidly as far as Rome. This is pretty good stuff, isn't it?
So thanks for staying a little bit late. I figured that should be, I think I lost the camera altogether now. I thought that might be interesting enough to kind of hold you over a little bit. But see, there we go. So any questions on that portion or what we had today? It's pretty fascinating to see just how everything coincides together and matches, especially you start putting the extra, the people outside the Bible that add in, facts that you don't really realize, it's kind of interesting to see that. So that'll be all we have for New Testament reliability as far as the biblical reliability as far as textual criticism. Well, actually, next week we'll watch. I have a video called fragments of truth, and it adds a little bit more. There's a little bit of overlap, but it adds a little bit more in there as far as the fragments and stuff to answer some of the things, showing you some things you were talking about earlier. We'll watch that next week. But thanks again for hanging out. Since I finished 30 minutes that one day, I'll just kind of recoup the 15 minutes for today. I still got 15 minutes to hold the future. But thanks for coming. I'll close in prayer real quick. Dear Heavenly Father, once again, as always, I'd like to thank you for the freedom we have to gather in your name and worship you. Thank you so much for the amount of evidence you're leaving us, and how strong the evidence is for your word, and how Jesus spoke of your word. Let us know that that is the word you're speaking to us. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.